In 1978, after successfully expelling the Americans, the emboldened Viet Cong declared war on Cambodia and invaded the neighboring country with the goal of liberating the Cambodian people from the oppressive Khmer Rouge government led by the infamous Pol Pot. China at this point was a close ally to the Khmer Rouge, so in 1979, Hoa Guofang ordered the invasion of northern Vietnam, beginning the Sino-Vietnamese War in efforts to dissuade the Vietnamese from toppling the Khmer Rouge. The incursion was a failure, and after only a month and losing 26,000 soldiers, the Chinese forces retreated, allowing the Vietnamese to ultimately prevail and ending the bloody rule of the Khmer Rouge. The Gang of Four would remain in jail, where they would be regularly beaten by the guards until their trial in 1980, where Jiang Qing was found guilty for her part in the death and destruction of the Cultural Revolution, as well as attempting a coup, and she was sentenced to death, although this would be later commuted to life in prison. Hua Guofeng tried to largely continue Mao's policies, but began to face increasing criticism from the progressive wing of the party that he was forced to step down in 1981, being followed by Deng Xiaoping after some savvy political maneuvering. Deng Xiaoping right away got to work with his long-awaited plans for economic liberalization in a movement called Bulan Fengzheng, which would attempt to help bring prosperity to China with the adoption of the called four modernizations, which included increasing yields in agriculture, strengthening the military, which was at this point 25 technological years behind the Soviet Union, adopting the scientific method to bring research and development capabilities up to Western standards, and finally to kickstart a new industrial sector. Previous central plans focused on the development of heavy industries such as steel and shipbuilding, but Deng Xiaoping recognized that years of monetary mismanagement had left China unable to invest the dollar amounts required to construct the infrastructure necessary, and instead enacted a plan to turn China into the world's factory by focusing on cheap and easily mass-produced products. The Chinese could offer unrivaled prices due to their low labor costs, and over the next several decades, scores of Western-based manufacturers moved their facilities to China in order to cut costs and offer greater values to customer. To help drive urgency among the Chinese public to increase GDP, it was finally made public that the Han Chinese who had escaped to Taiwan had at this point a GDP per capita 3 times that of the mainland's. Concurrently implemented with the economic reforms was a sweeping crime bill known as the Strike Hard Against Crime campaign of 1983. Ever since the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, China had been experiencing elevated levels of violence, with murder and rape running rampant. Several high-profile criminal cases occurring that year served as the impetus to pass the reforms. Former companies of the Red Guard, now unemployed, were one of the main sources of the violence. In February of that year, two brothers from Mukden, who were former members of the Red Guard, became infamously known as the Two Kings of the Northeast for their well-known crime sprees, where they first attempted to rob a military hospital but were consequently discovered by the staff. In their efforts to escape, the brothers shot and killed 4 people and were chased by authorities across the country, eventually being shot dead in a shootout with police in Fuzhou. Then in March, a retired veteran turned journalist was stabbed to death by a group of thieves after he pursued them after they took off with his wallet. Then in June, a criminal gang of teenagers operating out of the rural Hongqigo farm in Inner Mongolia decided they wanted to know what it was like to kill somebody. So they invited a group of 16 male acquaintances of the group to the farm where they proceeded to brutally stab them to death. Some members of the gang were put off by the killing and didn't want to take part, but were forced to against their will in order to make sure they wouldn't tell on the rest of the group. Unsatisfied, the gang members decided to roam the nearby countryside, kidnapping a group of females and bringing them back to the farm to rape them. Some of the girls were able to escape and alert the authorities, who in turn surrounded the farm. Knowing they were caught, some members of the gang decided to blow up the farmhouse with gasoline, although many of the gang members ended up surviving the blast but were spared the death penalty since most were underage at the time. The final incident that cemented the need for crime reform came in September when Zhu Guohua, the grandson of a prominent communist general, was arrested and charged with 15 counts of rape, 21 counts of torture, 26 counts of child molestation, and 17 counts of kidnapping, leading to his speedy execution. Under Mao's idealistic vision of a communist society, capital punishment had been mostly abolished in favor of forced labor and re-education camps. Deng Xiaoping reversed this trend, and in the first 3 years, the crackdown executed 30,000 violent offenders. While the campaign would be successful in reducing raw instances of crime, like similar laws being enacted in the United States at the time, the laws inadvertently led to skyrocketing incarceration rates, as well as instances of police officers being killed in the line of duty at 10 times higher than in the US during the same period. The campaign also took a long time, lasting officially until 2001 and unofficially to the rest of the 2000s, until crime was finally under control, partially through the Communist Party's vast investments in surveillance and biometric tracking. Deng Xiaoping also began liberalizing Chinese society, permitting freedom of press, and some light criticizing of the Communist Party to be published. Religion, which had been banned since the ascension of the party, was now allowed once again, although houses of worship had to be registered with the state, a requisite that echoed from the far distant imperial past. Many more conservative members within the party began to become concerned that the loosening of the restrictions on speech would lead to political instability, and their fears became realized when large groups of university students began taking to the streets in protest that the promised reforms were not being enacted fast enough. Many of these protesting students were radically liberal for Chinese societal standards and wanted a sudden transition to a democracy. After this bold arrest, Deng Xiaoping publicly stated that China was not ready for a democracy, which he believed would begin another civil war. In 1989, the student protest came to a head in Beijing after a massive protest was organized at Tiananmen Square. Deng Xiaoping ordered PLA forces, including tanks, to approach the protesters and disperse them at any means necessary. It was during these crowd control efforts that the famous photo of the protester standing defiantly in front of an oncoming tank as it proceeds to run him over was taken, shocking the West, who now saw the CCP as an organization built to suppress the spread of democracy. In the end, 2,500 protesters were killed by police following the protest, and most of all, the individual freedoms rewarded during the previous few years were revoked, and freedom of press was all but destroyed. It is events like these that expose the CCP's fear of the people when they organize collectively. The high-ranking officials in the party understood Confucian concepts quite well, yet they chose not to believe them, as that would mean they would have to accept that the party does not have a divine right to rule. This fear of the masses carried over to state policy as it pertained to food supply. Those in power feared the destabilizing effects another famine could have on society, and thus they began to put in place laws such as the one-child policy, which would limit couples to having only one child in an effort to avoid overpopulation. This policy was especially unpopular in rural China, where families still relied on the labor of their children for the subsistence agriculture lifestyle, and it led to the all too common act of the abortion or infanticide of baby girls because of societal biases towards boys and the greater expected labor that they could provide. The public outrage related to what the West now referred to as the Tiananmen Square massacre led to a blitz of sanctions against China, pressuring Deng Xiaoping to step down that same year. He was followed by Jiang Zemin as the new chairman. Deng Xiaoping's efforts to liberalize China into his view of socialism with Chinese characteristics were quickly rolled back as Jiang Zemin consolidated power and attempted to return the country to a more isolationist approach like during the Mao era. One hallmark of Nixon's reapproachment to China was that the Americans quickly became the Chinese's primary supplier of arms. This relationship ended after 1989, forcing China to rely on the Soviet Union now for weapons. Following the collapse of their once adversary, the Russians and Chinese signed a declaration of friendship, with the Chinese happy to purchase large quantities of discounted Soviet weapons, no longer needed to protect the shell of the former global communist superpower of the North. Despite reasserting control over civilian life, the economy was in shambles, and the party was desperate to return some of the prosperity that began in the previous decade. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping would reemerge from quiet retirement as he embarked on a tour across southern China promoting his new self-titled theory, which he claimed to have learned from the past mistakes of reform. In his belief, if only the economy is liberalized, not forms of individualism and expression, then all the tragedies of 1989 could be avoided. Deng Xiaoping began pushing a vision of rapid economic expansion through construction and infrastructure investment, ideas which became incredibly popular with the party and the public alike, with one of the most profound projects being the clearing of the inner city suburbs, or inner city slums, excuse me, and replacement with the new apartment tower blocks. Deng's ideas were so popular that at the point of his death from Parkinson's disease in 1997, the party officially adopted Deng Xiaoping theory at the party congress that year as official policy. Meanwhile, relations with the U.S. had hit an all-time low since reapproachment when President Bill Clinton authorized the sale of weapons to Taiwan, which had recently become a multi-party democracy just a decade prior. Feeling the anxiety of the now sole global superpower arming Taiwan, China began a campaign to modernize its military, officially separating the PLA away from the CCP for a more efficient management structure. It was in the 1996 Taiwanese election when, in a bid to intimidate Taiwanese voters into not supporting a pro-independence candidate, the PLA conducted a series of provocative military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Equally provocative, President Clinton ordered a U.S. naval fleet into the strait, forcing the PLA to retreat in embarrassment. This episode of increasing tensions between China and the U.S. illustrates the fundamental differences in the two countries' understanding of the One China policy, the name for the status quo in diplomatic relations since Nixon visited back in 1972, in that the U.S. agreed to officially recognize the CCP, while at the same time offering weapons to Taiwan to bolster their defense of the island. Also in 1997, a 99-year lease signed between the British for the island of Hong Kong expired, leading to its peaceful reversion back to Chinese control. Back in 1898, when the British signed the lease, they most likely never expected to have to give the territory in the future due to the extended period of time, but nonetheless handed over control after requesting additional reassurances that the increased personal freedoms held by the people of Hong Kong be upheld for at least the next 50 years. In 1999, a similar agreement was reached with Portugal, which saw them hand over control of Macau. Both territories would maintain a level of independence under the One China, Two Systems policy, which allowed certain territories to become special administrative districts with situation specific rights protected. The further economic liberalization of China during the 1990s caused a rapid rise in personal income for the average Chinese citizen, yet there now existed fewer personal freedoms on how one could spend this money. Lack of entertainment options commonly found in the West that were deemed too suggestive or liberal were supplanted with social movements and fads, most prominently the Qigong fever of the final decade of the 20th century. Qigong is a general term for the practice of controlled body breathing exercises, and the Communist Party initially was supportive of these groups, which they saw as an innocuous pastime that would keep the population happy and healthy. Due to the aforementioned lack of purpose or economic goals, many people who joined these movements became incredibly devoted and even radicalized, with the most notorious Qigong group being Falun Gong, which was founded by the controversial figurehead Li Hongzhi. Falun Gong openly opposes homosexuality, feminism, and modern medicine, and is considered by many to be a far-right extremist group. Fearing a loss of control over the radical followers of Falun Gong, the government banned the group in 1999 and exiled Li Hongzhi, where he subsequently moved to New York State, purchasing some land in the Catskill Mountains where he would construct the new headquarters of the global Falun Gong movement, which he would call Dragon Springs. Widespread accusations of the CCP torturing members of Falun Gong were published internationally, increasing support for Li Hongzhi and his beliefs, allowing him to found a successful far-right American newspaper called the Epoch Times, as well as funding the traveling show Shen Yun, which is a performance of traditional Chinese dance which predates the rise of the communists and whose supporters feel as real Chinese culture, just waiting to emerge from the suppressing tentacles of a centrally planned society. Somehow, at this point, U.S.-Chinese relations took a further turn for the worse when NATO air forces led by American troops conducting an aerial bombing mission in Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy there, killing 3 Chinese reporters. China demanded a thoughtful and genuine apology for the mission's careless actions, yet the American government only would agree to a basic apology, stating that civilian losses were just a part of military exercises. This response outraged the Chinese public, and massive anti American protests began across the country, beginning a global resentment towards American hegemony and its callousness and indifference towards the deaths of civilians from other countries. Amid this backdrop, Taiwan elected a pro independence leader for the first time in the island's history, something that China saw as a direct affront to the One China principle. When it seemed like the relationship could not get any worse, an American spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea in 2001. Everything would change a few months later when the U.S. was hit with the gut punch of the 9/11 attacks. The new president, George W. Bush, had a unifying message for Americans in the wake of the attacks. If you wanted to be a true American patriot, all you needed to do is go out and buy in order to boost the economy. Almost overnight, the US and China mended their relations under the guise of a cooperation against terror, and the Chinese factories began ramping up production to supply American consumers with vast amounts of cheap goods. Previously, China had to compete with its East Asian neighbors in the market for cheap goods sold in the US, but despite all its shortcomings, the centrally planned economy of China weathered the final years of the 90s generally unscathed, while the rest of East Asia was decimated by a massive regional stock market bubble and crash, leading to some countries, such as Japan, having their stock market capitalization today still being below their peak in the late 90s bubble. This series of events put China in the prime position to be the world's unrivaled factory for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. In 2002, Jiang Zemin stepped down as chairman and was followed by Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao was now part of the fourth generation of leaders to grow up since the Communist Revolution, and he right away began to promote his personal ideas titled The Scientific Outlook on Development, which was a Confucian line of thinking that economic reform alone cannot appease the people, but rather other strides must be made to increase the average Chinese person's quality of life. While China's coastal cities were exploding in growth and prosperity, the rural countryside was still very much stuck in a bygone era. And at this point, the CCP took a major shift in supporting legislation that diverted money away from the cities to fund large scale infrastructure projects to improve the quality of life for people living in the country. This generosity did not extend to personal freedoms, however, and the burgeoning internet was monitored and blocked from almost the get go. In 2008, the country fell into international spotlight when they hosted that year's Olympic Games in Beijing, although the Games were somewhat overshadowed by massive separatist protests in Tibet. Hu Jintao would step down in 2012 and be followed by Xi Jinping, whose primary goal was to put a stop to the uncontrollable corruption that began to permeate the Communist Party once the free market reforms had been implemented. Sensing his country's newfound strength following Western countries' reliance on China's manufacturing might, Xi Jinping began an aggressive international push of the infrastructure projects of the previous administration in a plan he called the Belt and Road Initiative, which would help connect the countries of Central Asia to establish a Neo Silk Road as an alternative to the U.S. administered Persian Gulf shipping lanes. By 2015, the true effects of the one child policy were beginning to be felt as birth rates plummeted. So the government relaxed restrictions to allow couples to now have 2 kids. Then in May of 2021, the limit was increased to 3 kids, and 2 months later, it just entirely dropped. Surprisingly, around 2014, China and the US were still mostly in lockstep policy wise, with China attempting to support the US in the global war on terrorism by launching its own Strike Hard Against Violent Terrorism campaign. Within a few years, however, US intelligence began calling out the Chinese for using the fight against terrorism as an excuse for arresting and incarcerating minorities to use for forced labor, especially the Uyghurs from Xinjiang. Then in 2016, the US elected Donald Trump as the new president who promised to even the playing field in the trade relationship with China, claiming the Chinese were stealing intellectual property and participating in currency manipulation, causing the relationship to once again sour and beginning a trade war. Then in early days of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic took the world by storm, originating from Wuhan. Initial speculation by Western media outlets suggested that the coronavirus escaped from the Wuhan National Lab of Virology, but this theory was later debunked as the virus most likely originated from a wet market, the same origin of the much smaller but just as deadly SARS epidemic of 2002. International blame for the virus on the Chinese, paired with Xi Jinping's longer than expected quarantine lockdowns, caused the rest of the world to begin looking to onshore their manufacturing capabilities, removing their exposure to China. With an impending demographic disaster, the CCP must decide where their priorities lie and how important it is to them that they see the ultimate reunification of Taiwan. Even though Xi Jinping removed the presidential term limits in 2018, it appears from the outside that it is only a matter of time before the lack of any further growth in the quality of life will cause Confucian sentiment to rise up and topple the current regime in one form or another. Pollution from unchecked industrial growth, the sudden introduction of rampant consumerism, and its negative effects on Chinese society since the turn of the century, an unimaginably large property bubble driven by the fact that property values drive provincial government revenues, and mass levels of youth unemployment amongst college graduates all serve as fuel to this fire. This marks the final episode in the Chinese history series. I hope you enjoyed it.